The name of James Kirkup was once extremely well known to readers in the UK of poetry, and not just of poetry alone, but of travel books, of autobiographies, and he is virtually completely unknown today. He died in obscurity in Andorra 2 years ago, aged 94, and he was still writing then. Fortunately, all his work has survived in print in a series of books from Salzburg University Press. There are 2 volumes of short poems and 2 volumes of long poems, and what is sad is that he did an enormous amount of translations of poems from French, but not even Salzburg University Press could actually publish these. However, what we have is excellent. I first came across Kirkup's work when I was about 18. I was born in 1942, so this was about 1960. And Kirkup was still then being published by Oxford University Press. And I was living in Leeds as a student and as hopefully a poet in the making, and I came across Kirkup's work and I immediately took to it. His work is not that of a great poet in the sense of Eliot or Pound, but in the second rank of poets, his work stands up extremely well to the tests of time. I think he's also an extremely good poet to use as a teaching aid to children and no doubt to students who are trying to learn how to write. His work does not belong to any particular school. It is never obscure, and when he writes at his best, his work seems to exemplify the comment of Christopher Isherwood, "I am a camera." But there is a lot more to it than that. Kirkup had a great lyrical talent. He had an enormous ability to convey a sense of place. This was particularly interesting because he had been the first Gregory Fellow in poetry at Leeds University. I think it was about 1951 when the Gregory Fellowship was first established by Bonamy de Bray, Sir Herbert Reed and T.S. Eliot, using money from a Bradford publisher of very successful art books. And when I first read Kirkup, I managed to establish through one of his travel books that he had moved on to Japan, where he was a professor of English literature at the University of Sendai, a post he had for many years. Although Kirkup first established his fame through very frequent publication in The Listener, where his friend J.R. Ackerley was, for an incredible, I think about 20 years, a literary editor. Ackerley fostered Kirkup's talent and defended him and published him again and again. And it was this push through The Listener that gained Kirkup the fame he enjoyed. And then when he moved to Japan, he wrote a book called These Horned Islands, which was a kind of travel diary of flying to and settling in Japan. This was given an enormous lead review in the Sunday Times and became very quickly a bestseller. His autobiographies too were very, very successful. When I say his autobiographies, I'm talking about the first two volumes, The Only Child and Sorrows, Passions and Alarms. The Only Child was continuously in print for, I think, something like 50 years, and for all I know it may still be in print from Salzburg University Press. Kirkup had a very unusual background. He wasn't Oxbridge educated. He was the only child of a Durham South Shields joiner and his wife. His father lived through the Depression, going out every day with his joinery tools, hoping to find work and coming back without any. But Kirkup's gifts and his mother's and father's push, plus the fact he was an only child, enabled him to go to Durham University, where he studied modern languages. His period there was not happy. The professor of modern languages didn't like him and he didn't like Kirkup. It was a mutual dislike. Kirkup was already, as far as one can follow from his autobiography, flamboyantly gay, or probably in reality he was bisexual. And this did not go down well with the professor of modern languages. But Kirkup had an enormous flair for the subject. He studied, I believe, French and Spanish, but eventually he mastered something like 11 languages, including Vietnamese, which he did translations from, and Polish. And this was one of his main sources of income throughout his life. Very few people have this kind of gift. And Kirkup had it, and he read voraciously, and this impact from other literatures no doubt hugely informs his work. He wrote to me when I wrote to him in Japan he typed on Japanese rice paper, which was incredibly exotic, and certainly he was a figure of inspiration for me during those formative years. I went out of contact with him for many decades, and then I re-established contact with him, by which time he had moved to Andorra, which is a tiny country between France and Spain. Quite why he landed there or stayed there, I don't know, but I certainly think it did not help him to establish the fame he would have liked to have enjoyed. And in his old age it became very strange. His last volumes of his autobiography were not entirely truthful and at times were incredibly venomous. He wrote a long, extremely libelous attack on a novelist, Francis King, now dead, who had actually helped him. And it is one of the most monstrous attacks on anyone I've ever seen, and it doesn't seem to have any basis in reality whatsoever. He also entirely distorted my relationship with him. I never met Kirkup, and he did arrange for me to go and stay with a friend of his, long dead, called Rena Clayton, and her husband, and this lady sadly died of cancer, and I only visited her 2 or 3 times, and it was a pleasant, happy time. When Kirkup was writing this time to Ackerley, this only came out in one of his last volumes, and I only discovered this last year, and he made some completely absurd claims. I tried to persuade this woman, who could not tell the truth, that I was somehow trying to persuade her to give me the fare to visit Kirkup in Japan. I'm completely airphobic, and I've never gone further than Paris, and only since the Eurotunnel was established. And quite why I said these things to Ackerley, and why Ackerley believed them, I simply don't know. Nevertheless, I've managed to somehow reconcile the fact that he was very old and not, I think, entirely in his right mind when he wrote these attacks. I mean, Francis King suffered 15 pages, I only suffered a few lines. But his early poems remain unbelievably good. These poems were written around the early 1950s, when he was Gregory Fellow in Poetry at Leeds, and one of the most outstanding, if not the most outstanding, is A Visit to Bronteland. When I was a student in Leeds in the 60s, we had a college trip to Haworth, and I remember as we approached on a hired bus, I stood up and read this poem to the rest of the students on the bus. I think there were about 30 of them. And this is probably, possibly, his best, if not his very best poem, James Kirkup's A Visit to Bronteland. The road climbs from the valley, past the public park, and turns at the Haworth Cooperative Stores, into the grey stone village and the steep street leading to the parsonage, the inn, the WCs, to the church of St. Michael and All Angels, high in trees. The West Lane Baptist are putting on patience, the playbills say. The Heathcliff tea rooms are aglow with English teachers in sensible tweeds. Bearded cyclists lean on their pedals, and their saddles shine and sway up the hill to the YHA. Across the valley, thick with mills, the fell side rises like an aerial map of fields and dry stone walls and farms. Pylons saunter over with a minimum of fuss, and round the bend from Keighley comes the Bronte bus. An artist signboard poses Charlotte in a crinoline and ringlets, penning Jane Eyre at a table with a quill. This must be it. The wondering Americans, like Technicolor ads, have reverence plainly written on their open faces. They know just how one should behave in hallowed places. A sea of sculptured slabs shines in the graveyard under the twilight rain. The cold winds are crying in the trees. New heights above the pines are wothered by tractors of open cast mines. The church where the Brontes worshipped is long demolished. Only a brass plate marks where their bones are buried. Smothered in parts committed geraniums, Anne lies alone in Scarborough Old Churchyard under a dolled-up stone. Now, in the village roofs, the television aerial aspires. No idle toy would have tempted Bramwell from the bull and brandy, or kept that sister from her tragic poems. They knew they had nothing but themselves and the more. It is we who want all, who are poor. I think, looking at this poem now, some more than 60 years after it was written, it still shines with a marvellous transparency. I know Haworth extremely well, and I do feel that Kirkup in this poem caught its essentials, its strangeness, its sense of the mystical, and also a wonderfully ironic eye cast on the tourists who are now as plentiful as they ever were. And this to me is probably the most enduring vision of Haworth that anyone has written.